Everywhere you look, there's free advice for first home buyers, and a lot of it is just plain bad. So how can you work out what to take notice of and what to ignore?
Welcome to Your First Home Buyer Guide, the podcast for first home buyers who want to move it along and become homeowners. But most importantly, it is for you to become an educated home buyer.
I'm Meighan and that was Veronica. We're both buyer's agents and probably old enough to be your mum. But it's a good thing because between us we've got over 45 years experience to share with you and bucket loads of stories about avoidable mistakes. Together, we're going to make sure you get unbiased and real information you can rely on. Allow us to guide you on your home buying journey. We want you to become an educated home buyer so that you can stop looking for your first home and actually become a proud homeowner.
We've got loads of great tips for you in this episode, and if you'd like more useful tools, head over to the website homebuyeracademy.com.au, and there you'll get access to our free mini course, How to Price a Property Like a Professional. You will also find the holy grail of home buying education, Your First Home Buyer Guide, the online course for people who want to become educated home buyers. We created this for you to help you get on the right path to home ownership for your first home and beyond.
But before we get into the interesting stuff in this week's episode, we've got the boring bit, the disclaimer. You of course know that nothing in this podcast is to be taken as personal advice. We always recommend getting the advice of an expert in their field who takes the time to understand your personal situation. We've done our very best to ensure that the content is correct at the time of recording. Things change rapidly, so always check with the relevant government authority and your trusted advisors to get the most up-to-date information.
Today we're talking about commonly held opinions about property that are actually wrong. But before we get into that, what is your special house this week, Meighan? It's not often that I see one in the video behind you there that I actually like myself, because usually they're a bit out there. But
This is a style we don't see an awful lot of in Australia, but it's quite popular in the US. They call it barn dominium. But this is a property that sold in 2022. So I found this on realestate.com, and it sold for $3.83 million back in 2022. It's on a hectare of land in Tallebudgera, which is the hinterland of the Gold Coast. Look at that. Isn't it just so interesting, so fascinating? Like just a way it's almost put together in components.
Modular.
And yeah, modular. Yeah. It's not cargo containers. It is actually, it's been built in this way. Just really lovely.
I follow, actually on Instagram, I follow a number of those modular builds that build out in, the bush, not bush, but out in farmland and whatever. And it's a bit quite similar in style. The thing though, I look at that because it's got that really dark collar bond and the monument.
Good block and whatnot.
But it's really bad for the environment, and so even though I look at that,
it absorbs the heat.
Yes, exactly, and does not reflect. But anyway, I look at it and I love the aesthetic of it, and it looks like a nice setting, and it's photographed at sunset, and it's got a pool, and
tick, and a flashish piece of land, which is not
in
often
the hinterland.
That you get in the hinterland. So
beautiful. All right,
I prefer the beach myself, but I can appreciate.
See, I'm a
that,
Taurian,
sure.
so I go. Well, you're a Taurian too. I'm a
Taurian too.
I love the rolling hills. I just got a thing for them. They sing. All right. But recently, I was asked to go on the project and comment on the likelihood of anybody starting their property ownership journey today being able to build a large property portfolio, and it got me thinking about common myths about property that are just plain wrong. They're often compelling and we want to believe them, but they buckle under scrutiny. So today we're going to run through some of this bad advice so you will know what to avoid.
And this first one, Veronica, and by the way, I quite enjoyed that segment on the project. I think you gave a really balanced view. You've got strong opinions and you're very happy to share them. But, I think when people go out there and they talk, look, it's really easy to do this. It's just not. And it's not for everybody either. So, and we're talking about, someone who had a massive portfolio of 100 or so properties. So one of the things that we hear often, and it can be from first home buyers who have heard it from other places or read it somewhere, is you should buy as soon as you can afford anything just to get on the ladder. And it's something that we are absolutely passionate about, making sure that you don't step into the abyss of something that could potentially hold you back into the future. Because this is what a home is important. You have to have a roof over your head. It's a starting point. If you don't want to rent, you want to buy, but you don't want to have something that's going to be a shackle around your neck and hold you back from a future and whatever that future looks like for you. So just buying anything, I think, Veronica, is probably one of the biggest myths of good advice that we could probably put out there.
I reckon it's one of the worst pieces of advice, really, because it fails to understand that a lot of people actually do lose money in property. And it's not just the actual loss of when you sell something for less than you buy it for, and that does happen an extraordinary amount of time, but it's the opportunity cost over time. It's so some people, they don't sell, so they never actually incur the loss, but actually if they did sell, it would sell for less. Or if you're selling it 10 years after you bought it and it's worth the same as what you paid for it, then that's opportunity cost, because in that 10 years, other properties have gone up in value. And I think fundamentally, if that first property won't serve you long term, you could get stuck on that first rung or incur transaction costs a lot sooner rather than later when you need to upgrade. And I think that's why that first property is so important, to get it right, not just to get in as soon as possible.
Get it as best that you can. And we talk about A, B and C grade properties. Not everyone's going to be able to get into an A grade property, but making the right set of compromises for you that gives you the opportunity to use it, particularly if it's a stepping stone. And we talk about stepping stone properties. We actually have clients at the moment who have bought their first home. They've been in it for a couple of years, and they're buying an investment property, which is going to be a stepping stone towards where they want to live in the long term. So we're buying something in their affordability range, but in the area they want to buy, it's going to be A grade. It's going to grow at the rate, but their expectation is their incomes are going to be a lot higher in about 5 to 6 years' time, which will allow them to get into their dream home. So, they've really thought through the structure of how are they going to do this. What they felt was the first property they bought wasn't a good enough location. It hasn't served them well. It hasn't given them the equity that they need. So they're going to do it better with this second one. And so getting that one right will actually help them step in the long-term one.
And that leads to the second myth here, which is buy an investment property before you buy a home to live in. And
can work.
For some people, this can work. But when it's given as the way to get into the market sooner so that you can get on the ladder quicker, and so therefore you can become a property owner, without considering, well, are you going to be in a position in, say, 5 years' time where you can afford to buy your own home whilst keeping this investment property? And this is often the conversations that are not had. It's just this assumption that you build a property portfolio, which means you never have to sell and you get equity and then you go and borrow more money. And it actually doesn't work that well. The guy that was, the case study on the project story, his first property I think he bought was something like 13 or 15 years ago. Now, back then, if you talk to mortgage brokers, you could borrow up to 14 times your income. Yeah. Now, and it's around up to 4.5 times.
Sometimes up to 100% too.
Yeah.
Yep. And there was no doc loans, there were low doc loans. It was a completely different lending environment.
Massively different lending environment. And so when you're constrained like you are today, which is around about 4.5 times your income, then borrowing capacity becomes a very scarce resource. Yeah. And that means if you go out borrowing to buy an investment property, and then in a few years' time, you're able to afford to buy your own home, but then all of a sudden that investment property is a noose around your neck. We've had clients come to us that they've done this. Then they've had to sell those investment properties so they can buy a home. And it's great that they made some gain, but they have to pay tax on that gain. Whereas if they just bought a home to live in the first place, then they actually wouldn't have to pay tax on that gain when they upgrade. So there's just lots of different ways to go about this, and it does depend on every individual circumstances, but just blanket saying buy an investment property first is, in my view, really bad advice.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And there are lots of examples, I think, where people have either come to me in our businesses and said, look, we just wanted to get in. So we bought the best that we could at the time, but now we can't do what we want to do. We're going to have to sell it. And if the strategy was to sell that property, so we're really well thought out, here's our time frame, the reason we're doing it is to be in the market, where we want to buy our dream home. We know our income's going to go up and that will give us the increased borrowing capacity. That's a really well thought out and planned mortgage strategy that people have actually sat down and thought about, okay, what are the steps? What are the risks? Where are the benefits? Where are we going to lose money in paying tax on sale? All of those things. If you go into a purchase with all of that information and understanding your risks and it's right for you, that's good. But it's not just taking the advice, as you say, of get anything you can. If you can't afford to live can't afford to buy where you want to live, rent there and buy an investment property somewhere else. That may not be the right strategy. It might end up costing you an awful lot, as you say, an opportunity cost, what you could have been doing with your money, and also potential lost capital growth if you buy in the wrong spot.
Yeah. And so, yes, that can work for some, but it can be an absolute trap for others. So that blanket advice is really bad. Here's another one, which we hear, and in fact was on that story as well, which is got to buy under market value. Like it sounds really sensible, doesn't it? Of course, pay less than it's worth. But like, let's be real here. How easy is that?
Well, it depends on the market. Okay. So
and it depends on the property.
You need to, there's a couple of things here. There's market forces and there's also property quality.
Yeah.
We have a Home Buyer Academy property principle, which is if it's easy to buy, it's going to be hard to sell. And what that means is if there's no one else competing for the property, there's probably something wrong with it. And when you go to sell it down the track, it's still probably going to have something wrong with it if you can't fix it. Now, whether that's a main road or flood affected or backing onto a train line or, right under the flight path at a really low level, these are things that can't be overcome. You cannot get rid of them. You can fix a bad kitchen, you can fix a colour scheme, you can add an outdoor living area, but there are some things that can't be fixed. So if you're going into something thinking, every other 3-bedroom in this suburb is selling for $680 and I can get this one for $620, that means it's a bargain. I am going to be so far ahead of the race. There's probably a reason that it's $620,000 and those people with $680,000 don't want to buy it. And you've got to find that out. You've got to uncover it and you've got to make sure that you're not compromising the quality of the asset, thinking that you're getting something less than market value.
There's also this concept of market value. I got a bargain because I got it less for market value. Well, actually, no. What you paid is market value.
It's market value.
Because if nobody else wanted it, that's the only reason you could get it for that price, which is actually market value. And so there's this sort of myth around, you got to look around for a market. But it's not a bargain. You, my friend, just set market value. So I think that's something that, it's compelling. It sounds smart. Like it sounds, of course, let's try and buy it cheap. Yeah. But when you really dig into it and you realise that you're buying a very important asset for your financial future, and if you're buying a crap asset, then,
it doesn't matter what price you pay for it.
It doesn't matter what price you pay for it.
It's interesting that there's actually a buyer's agency group that advertises the fact that they will always buy under market value. Now, I can certainly say that there have been some market conditions where we've been pleasantly surprised at what we've been able to negotiate in the purchase. But as you say, at the end of the day, that's market value because that's what we were prepared to pay for it. Whether comparable sales said it was worth more or not. But, it's fascinating. I heard one the other day that said, we will get you a $2 million property for $1.8 million. Now, that's just absolutely impossible in Brisbane. And to fall for that kind of sales pitch, open your eyes. That is not possible. What they will do is inflate the appraisal price. And then you feel like you got a bargain. But reality is, you've got to do your research yourself, know what market value is or what comparable sales indicate market value would be, and then be prepared to spend the right amount of money on a quality asset, not the lowest amount of money on a crap asset.
But I hate those sales tactics. They don't belong in property, but they are in property. It's it's like it never was a $2 million property. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like it's actually probably 1.7 million and you paid 1.8. Anyway, that just does my head in. So don't fall for it, please. Now, the other one that you'll find from a lot of these spruikers, these people that go out there selling sort of impossible dreams in the property space, is instant equity uplift. What the hell does that even mean?
What does that
Meighan?
mean, Veronica? Give me, I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, I don't spend time listening to spruikers. I don't read their material. I don't watch their YouTube video. give us an explanation of what that is apparently meant to mean.
Oh my God. So you see this a lot in sort of Facebook posts and Instagram posts, and it's usually a picture of the front of a brand new home, and it's got, the clients paid $650,000, they settled, it got valued for $700,000. That's an instant equity uplift of $50,000, right? And it's like, who valued it, right? Who valued it? And how long ago did they pay that money, the $650,000? And so have they sat there with a deposit sitting there for 2 years? I mean, there's none of this background information that puts context around this. And who is the valuer and who do they work for, as well? Like, do they work for the spruiker, or do they work for the bank, or do they work for the client, or are they an independent valuer that they've got in just for their advertise, whatever? But like this, the fact is that if you had to sell it today, would you get your $700,000? Now that's an instant equity uplift, right? And then you got to think, well, all the costs, etc., blah blah blah. But so it's a myth that never gets to be tested, and I think that's the thing that does my head. And it's like, and it suggests to people that you can go in and buy brand new under market value again, and they're all rubbery figures, and it's all about selling a dream and selling this sort of impossibly easy to buy property, and it's impossibly easy to make money. Well, it is. It's impossible to be easy to make money in property.
Easy to make
really.
money.
So
absolutely, yeah. Hard work.
Ignore that stuff.
Hard work and hard research. It's an interesting one because even I guess I would sort of be a little bit reticent to believe the equity uplift story, but compared to what is that a good result? So as you say, if you paid $650 for it and then had a valuation at $700, what were other properties that weren't brand new and had some of these negatives that lots of the same around it? Did they go up 100,000 in that period of time?
Yeah. Yes.
So was your 50,000 increase at the same pace and level as something else that might have been a better quality property in a better location?
Was it underperformance?
Comparability, was it underperformance?
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's that lack of a benchmark that does my head in. It's just using whole round numbers to entice people into making decisions that if they just step back a little bit and were able to look critically, because it's very difficult to look critically when you're not an expert in this space. You don't sit there and pore over these results like you and I do. It is difficult. And also we want it to be true. We want it to be us. We want to be the person that actually has this instant equity uplift. We want it to be our story. But it is, it's a marketing trap.
It is, and it also it does create a bit of a social status kind of event when you can talk about these types of things. I bought under market value. I had instant equity uplift. Like, these are really cool things that people love to talk about at a barbecue or by the water cooler at work if you're back at the office, over Teams if you're not. But they are things that people like to share. Oh, we did this and it was great. We bought really well and it's gone up so much. Well, you don't know how much something's gone up until you actually sell it, which is a point that you made earlier. So until you actually sell, and then you have a benchmark to compare against as to whether that did well or didn't do well. Did it meet your needs? Was it actually the right property for you in the end of the day? No use buying a 2-bedroom apartment under what you think is market value if you need 3 bedrooms and in 2 years you're going to have to move out. It's instant equity uplift. It's a really interesting one because there are properties where you call them Nana's house, I call them Grandma's house, really solid, well-maintained, well-positioned properties with good functional layouts that can have a bit of an instant equity uplift. We would call it adding value, but it takes time, effort and money to achieve those sorts of things.
That's exactly right. And they're scarce. They're not easy to come by.
They're not easy to buy.
And they're not easy to buy. And when you manage to actually get it right, then that's a real success story. But they're very difficult to actually achieve. And
they take effort.
On the Elephant in the Room podcast a couple of years back, Chris and I were approached by a fellow that worked, his partner in a business and they're in this sort of spruiker space. And we tend to never, interview these people. We don't want to give them any airtime. But he had all these sort of statistics around, how his clients had outperformed the market consistently by a tune of 28% or whatever it was. And there was all these sort of data around this. And I thought the data's really interesting. And I'm really keen to unpack that.
Yeah.
So we got him on. And it soon became quite evident that they had plenty of data, of course, but they had no benchmarking. And so, for example, they pulled on the spot, literally on the spot, we just said, well, give us an example of an individual who has sort of made this miraculous money, and chose a suburb in Brisbane, and I can't remember the name of it, but there's a big tip right next door to it or in it. Anyway, chose this name of this suburb, and it was an infill site. So it's not a new suburb on the edge of Brisbane. It's sort of in the middle of somewhere in the 10 to 15K ring, I think, from memory. And so, like, while we're talking, he's telling us his story, we pull up the map and we're looking at it, and I've gone, there's a really great big tip there. Did you not notice that? And he was, he sort of had no answer for it. And then Chris was, hang on a minute. So your client paid $650, and then, how many years later, it's worth $850, and you're saying that that's a really great result and that outperformed. And what did it outperform? And he's like, well, outperformed others in the same suburb. He said, yeah, but like I had clients in Brisbane that bought in other suburbs in Brisbane for $650, in the same period. And now their property is worth $1.2 million, not $850. So your clients, they might have outperformed that suburb. So clearly the suburb had a problem. And if they'd spent the same amount of money elsewhere in the same city at the same time, they could have done heaps better. And this was live because we literally were just digging, we're interrogating his data that he was claiming all these successes. And it was not hard to unpick, but that's because we know the questions to us, we know things to look for. But for anyone else, at first, until we started interrogating it, it sounded compelling, which is why we got him on the podcast. So
interesting,
it's
and
easy to fall for this stuff.
Yeah, and that sounds really enthralling to have that kind of growth. But as you say, unless you've got a benchmark to say, well, if they'd spent that money somewhere else, what could they have achieved? And that's opportunity cost. That's what could your money have done if it was invested somewhere else. I just want to backtrack about 13 minutes. We talk about what's easy to buy is hard to sell. I want to explain just a little bit for those who are just tuning in for the first time. Welcome to the podcast. For those of you who have been here for 203 episodes, welcome back. But what we mean by that is competition. So it is the competition from other people that makes all other things being equal, makes a good quality asset hard to buy, because you're competing with other people who see the quality, who it's a scarce resource. That is, there's not a lot of it. It can't be easily reproduced. So it's the competition from other buyers that makes a property hard to buy. When there's no competition from other buyers, that's when it's easy to buy, even in a competitive market. So that's what we mean by easy to buy, hard to sell.
Yeah, exactly right. Because the simple fact is that if you've got other people that also want to buy it, then when you go to sell it down the track, assuming that you're not just buying in a hot market where everything's flying out the door, but like you've got to be picky, you've got to be choosy, you've got to actually embrace the fact other people want to buy the property rather than try to avoid competition.
Absolutely.
And that's the sort of a mind shift change that we want to encourage you to. We don't like competing. We don't like having to pay top dollar. We don't. But I do like to buy a good asset that someone else is going to fight for when I go to sell it at some point down the track.
Spot on.
That's what I want. And so if I have to compete now for that, then I will compete and I will give myself all the information in terms of pricing and strategy and all that sort of stuff to make sure that I'm competing for a good asset. All right. So, and
that's it.
This sort of same vein, the next myth is buy the worst house on the best street.
Yeah, and it's been around a really long time. I was given that advice by my parents. I think I was given that advice by the man that I worked for at the Athlete's Foot when I was 18. I think, it is universal.
Sounds sensible, doesn't it?
Universally, one of those things that when someone is saying, oh, you're thinking about buying a house, that's one of the first things that comes out. But I think the thing to think about is only if it has the potential to be better and you have the ability to do the work to make it better. So buying the worst house in the best street, if that house is at the bottom of a dip and it has overland flow or flood affected, or you can't build underneath it, or there are limitations, or it has a massive stormwater manhole access right under the middle of the property and you can't do anything with it, that's not a good property to buy.
Years
regardless
ago,
of whether your neighbour's $10 million or not.
That's exactly right. It will always be the worst house in the best street. And people who want to buy on the best street can generally afford to buy on the best street. They're not going to like your house. Like it's going to be the one that doesn't get competition, And in fact, years ago, I bought one of the worst houses on the best street and I did renovate it and I did sell it. And the things that it's before I was a buyer's agent, so I didn't eye things with the same critical nature that I do now. And things that I overlooked that if I should have just paid a little bit more attention to, I wouldn't have bought that house. And those things did cause me a problem when I went to sell it, and I wasn't critical enough. That's the things that you learn. And we want you to avoid these mistakes early on in life without needing to go through all the years of experience that we've gone through to learn these lessons, right?
We give it to you. We give this to you free.
Well, the podcast is free. And if you really want to get some structure around this and make really good decisions, then it's only $9.90 to buy the course. But anyway, the next myth, grab all the government grants you can.
Which, I was thinking back, we were talking a bit earlier about, buy anything you can just to get into the market. And this kind of fits with that a little bit. I think it's kind of an extension of that because many of the government grants have incentives, have things like price caps, which limit you to how much you can spend. There's also salary caps and other things that assess whether they think that you're worthy of these grants and incentives. But price caps will put a limit on how much you can spend. And many of them are contingent on you buying something that's brand new. So the reason for that, the reason behind that kind of strategy is they want to add to the amount of properties that are available in the marketplace. So that in and of itself isn't a bad thing because we do need more housing. We need more housing built. We need more apartments built. That's not a bad thing. But for a first home buyer who is looking to purchase the best asset that they can, that may not be in your best interests.
So like with all of these, bad pieces of bad advice, there are some times when it might be good advice, right? But they also sound logical until you pull them apart a little bit. And that's what we just encourage you to sort of develop that critical thinking muscle. And in this particular case, as Meighan's just saying, that when you got price caps, you know what? If you can't afford to pay more than the price cap, then it doesn't matter. But if you can, and that price cap is limiting you to buy something that actually won't serve you as long or is not as good an asset, then long term it's actually going to cost you more money than you'll get for free from the government. So really, our advice around this piece of bad advice is that grab them when it suits you and it fits in your overall strategy, but don't build your overall strategy around grabbing as many grants as possible.
Yeah. And I think about, those people who are perhaps looking at their first property as a stepping stone to the next one. You may grab the grants and feel like, oh, I've got $50,000 in my pocket for nothing. But if you've got to move out of that property reasonably quickly, then you're immediately not a first home buyer. So you don't get any stamp duty concessions. You may actually find that that's all been taken away when you pay the stamp duty on the upgrade. Whereas if you bought the better property that you could afford, if you could afford it, as a first home buyer and got the stamp duty concessions, you might have actually not had to do the transaction and changeover costs, which can add up to about 5%.
And definitely adds up. Well, again, that's another different type of opportunity cost. That's just lost opportunity there.
Yeah.
Now, another piece of bad advice, which can sometimes be good advice, but can be bad as well, is never buy strata title. Now, in some areas, I agree. Never buy strata title. And in some buildings, I agree, never buy strata title. However, like if you're a first home buyer in Sydney, well, good luck to you if you're going to try to get your first property in Sydney without buying strata title. I think it's a really bad advice because often it can lead people looking in areas or types of properties that they really shouldn't be looking at.
Yeah.
Whereas actually a strata, and we're talking villas, units, townhouses here. Sometimes that can be a really good option for a first home buyer.
Yeah. And strata title, let's just have a think about it. The most expensive piece of a property that you buy is the land that sits under the building. The land is the thing that, should cost the most amount of money. And if you're buying strata title, what you're doing is sharing in the cost of purchasing that land with the other owners that are in the building. So you're kind of dividing up the cost of the land and paying more for the building that sits on top of that. That's not a bad thing if it meets all the other needs and you have assessed the property as being good for the area. We say to people, you've got to match from an investment point of view, you've got to match the demographic of the potential renter and the future buyer to the type of property that you're purchasing in the area that you're purchasing at. There is no use having a one-bedroom apartment in a suburban area like Camp Hill. There's no demand for it.
Yeah.
But a one-bedroom apartment with parking in, particularly an Art Deco building in New Farm, highly sought after, always going to perform really, really well. They're never going to reproduce these things. They don't rebuild them. They've got a lot of architectural interesting aspects to them, and they're usually in good streets. So I could never say to someone, do not even think about buying strata title or freehold is better. You've actually got to dig down and understand where you're buying, what you're buying, how scarce is it? Is it easy to reproduce? What are the other options? How much will it cost you to buy something in that same area if you owned the land and nobody else was part of it? And then you've got to also weigh up, how much of the strata fees cost, and do a proper analysis of that versus if you had to pay the insurance yourself, you had to pay your maintenance yourself. The cost of rates is higher when you're on freehold versus strata. So you really got to make a proper assessment of the differences in the holding costs. And sometimes, as I think you've done for yourself in the past, or currently thinking about your next move, is when you weigh those things up, there's sometimes not that much difference.
And that's the thing, that there's a bit of a furphy around, but strata levies. And it's like, yeah, but it costs money to own a house too, and you've got to maintain it. You should maintain it. Although some people don't. I know that. The other thing too about land value is that land becomes increasingly expensive in certain areas. So the more dense an area, and it doesn't necessarily mean the land is expensive. You can have dense areas on the outskirts of cities, for example, where the land is actually not that expensive, but in the inner city areas and where there's areas of high desirability, apartments in those areas can, the land content might be small as a total of as a proportion of what you own, but the land, that is actually quite valuable. So, we've got to look for things like scarcity and all that sort of stuff that Meighan was talking about. And we've done a number of episodes on strata and what to look for in units and townhouses, etc. Our last, we got three more. I said our last. We've got three more pieces of bad advice. One that we've done a couple of episodes on, which is avoid lender's mortgage insurance, or LMI.
I just think it's such a shame that people are so close-minded to this as being an option to explore. I used it with one of my properties because it was at the start or early on in Brisbane's 2002 property boom, and my partner and I could not outsave the market movements. So we put a line in the sand and said, if it's going to cost us $11,000 or $15,000, I can't remember how much it was, to actually get into a property right now versus waiting another 6 months to save even more than that, it just doesn't make sense for us to wait. This is an expense that we will suck up and absorb, because otherwise we're going to be left behind by $50,000, $60,000 in a matter of a couple of months, which is way more than the lender's mortgage insurance was. So I think it's really important to find a really good broker that can talk to you about all the options, including lender's mortgage insurance.
Yeah.
Now, it pays the bank to manage your risk. So if you default and they have to sell the property, they've got some insurance there to cover any shortfall. And that's really all that is about. It covers the bank's risk. But it does give you, at a cost, an option to get into a property as long as you have the borrowing capacity and it's within your comfortable repayment sort of range. Then it is absolutely something that you should talk to a broker about, because you might find the amount of time that it takes you to save that amount of money could be way longer than it would take you just to get in there now, get a good property under your belt, and ride the capital growth if you're in a rising market.
Now, again, like so many of these pieces of bad advice, sounds sensible. Of course you should avoid this cost, particularly if you're actually insuring the bank's risk, not even your own. However, this is really about deciding and with good advice, as Meighan said, with mortgage brokers, but deciding what's right for you. And also it's relative to market conditions as well, because obviously if you can outsave the market, then why not? Then don't pay LMI. But if you can't outsave the market, then it certainly can give you an option to get into the market sooner if that's appropriate for you.
And there's different calculators around that can help you look at what that looks like. Absolutely, the best advice is going to come from a mortgage broker, because every bank has a different rate of lender's mortgage insurance, right? So it's not just set and forget. But there are places like we interviewed Strawn Taylor from Hellier. They have an online calculator. You can go on and say, look, if I've only got this much deposit and I want to borrow this much, how much is lender's mortgage insurance going to be? Gives you an idea to start a conversation then with a broker who will talk about your unique and individual situation.
Yep. Our second last piece of bad advice is the only way to make money in property is to renovate.
Well, it's also a way to lose money too.
Yeah. I've seen plenty of people overcapitalize. They've gone a bit crazy and they've underestimated. And this is something that a lot of people overestimate what they can do.
Back here.
Was that?
So much to unpack here.
Oh, yeah. Often people overestimate what they can do to a property and they underestimate what it's going to cost. And so that's how you can...
And they overestimate what they think other people are going to think it's worth.
Yeah. Well, they just don't. So look, if you know what you're doing, you can make money by renovating. I've made money by renovating. Some of that maybe a little bit early on anyway, a little bit more good luck rather than good management, but it's not a given. It's absolutely not a given. And so a lot of people say, right, I should buy something to renovate. Well, again, back to that, like, for example, if the alternative is I'm going to buy an unrenovated, rambling shambles of a house that I'm never really going to be able to get around to fixing because I can't afford to, and I actually don't know how to hammer a nail, or a townhouse for the same sort of money in a similar suburb that can actually last me, and serve me and my family for a good, 7-10 years, then you know what? I'd be saying to somebody, go the townhouse. But if you collaborate, or you get all these pieces of bad advice together, you can see the disaster that can be brewing, right? You can see why people think like you have to renovate. It's like, not necessarily. Like, I've seen people blow so much money renovating and not get it back.
My second renovation that I did was just as I was selling real estate. So I'd only been in the industry for about 6-7 months maybe. And I did a joint venture with a family member, and I found this property that had 4 bedrooms and a sort of a shed, and a lined shed. And I'm like, I'm going to renovate this. I'm going to turn that into a granny flat. I'm going to put a deck on the back. I'm going to make it look amazing. And what I didn't realise at the time was that the 4 bedrooms were all so small that the buyers that went through, after the house looked pretty, the buyers went through and went, I can't even fit a single bed and a bedside table and a desk in here for my children. So, I've gone, whoa, 4 bedrooms, yeah, this is going to be great. People are going to be falling all over themselves. And I put a second bathroom in the granny flat. So then it was 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms. I just completely missed what the buyers needed, and that was good proportioned rooms. And it was a really big lesson for me, because I think I lost about $25,000 on that project. There was a lot to review, take in, and unfortunately the market turned when I put it out for sale as well. So there was a few things that really I didn't understand, and it was a lot of money and time that was wasted doing that renovation without the knowledge that I really needed to have to understand. When you're doing a renovation, you have to know what the future buyer is going to want in that property, and you have to renovate to that, not to your individual taste.
Not very much so. Now, and that leads in a way to our final piece of bad advice, which was you can time the market, buy in a down market.
Buy at the bottom and
sell at the top. It's like, again, it's great in theory, right? Really sounds compelling. Of course you would do that. It doesn't always work that way. For starters, no one actually knows when the bottom and the top of the market is until usually about 6 months afterwards, where we can clearly see it in the data. And so that's the first thing.
Because we can have false starts, and we've seen a couple of false starts of what we think is a slowing market, and then go, no, the buyers are still out there paying that money. We're still in a rising market. But bottom of the market, that's the harder one to judge.
It's really hard. And look, when you're buying, our advice is always you need to buy when you are ready, when you have found the right property, right? So that, and
when you're financially capable.
And the rest of it has to be noise, because at the end of the day, it's quite difficult to find the right property and to get ready to buy. And so then you can't then go, and now I'm going to wait for the bottom because, and everyone sits on the fence and they all hop off at the same time, and the markets start rising, and all of a sudden everyone's scrambling and FOMO again. And again, no one can really pick when the beginning of how long is the upturn going to go for? Or I mean, and we have studied this.
I'm going to wait for prices to slow.
Oh, yeah. Good. Yeah. I mean, and do they? When is convenient with you?
But they've risen between now and then.
And they will slow. They actually will slow it sometimes. And sort of, I bought and sold many properties over the years, and sometimes I've managed to buy at exactly the bottom and sell at exactly the top. And I've done the complete and utter opposite as well, because at the end of the day, you've got to be thinking about like what your plans are, and you've got to have an eye on the future. So I haven't agonized too much about the timing, because the timing hasn't been the major decision. That's just been incidental, right? When you're buying, to wait for the market to fall, for the conditions to suit you, is folly, mainly because on average, prices rise more than they fall. And so just the odds are not in your favour. But even then, you're assuming that the right property is going to come onto the market when prices fall. And what typically happens when prices fall is that anybody with a good listing, a good property, they're going to, I'm going to wait now until prices rise again. Right?
So you've got less to choose from.
So yes, so it actually becomes more difficult to buy when prices slow down. And also then you go, I'm looking around and no one else is buying. This doesn't feel like a smart idea. I better wait and see if they fall even further. And, it's a mug's game. So it's, in theory, it's a great idea, but in practice, it's something that we really encourage you to take your eye off that and really focus on buying when you're ready, when you found a good asset, when you find the right property for you.
There is a lot of advice in here that hopefully we've given you pause for thought, to sit back a little bit, to see that there are many sides to some of this advice, and there are things in there that you can take away and deconstruct and have a look at. You've got to make sure that every bit of advice that you are choosing to listen to, remember you choose. You don't take advice from somebody who, you wouldn't listen to. You've got to take advice from people who are knowledgeable and experts in their area, or take advice from somebody who you don't necessarily think has good advice and go and test it with people who know what they're doing. So that means that you're then saying, okay, well, that sounds like a good idea. I'm going to now go and talk to a mortgage broker about whether that's a good idea or not in my situation, for my circumstances and for my goals, for my family, or for myself as an individual. So I think, by all means, take all of this in, but test it. Test it with people who know what they're doing, and they don't have a vested interest in getting you or shoehorning you into something that may not be the best thing for you in the long term.
And to that end, you can join our Facebook group, because you can pose these questions or bring to us these pieces of advice and test whether we think it's good or bad. It's called Your First Home Buyer Guide Australia, and it's your opportunity to connect with us and ask us your questions, and you'll get answers from us, and sometimes from Jules, who does post them on our behalf, which means that you can be sure that you're not...
I'm terrible at posting. Jules and I talk about the answers and then she posts them, because...
And I like them to show that we've actually read them. But this is not somebody, you don't get answers from people who don't know what they're talking about, right?
That's right. Now, a quick note, you might think that we cover everything you need to know on this podcast, but a word of warning, we don't. We just scratch the surface here. If you really want to be an educated first home buyer, you need to learn all of the steps and how to do everything in the right order.
And our first home buy guide course only costs $990, and you get direct access to us to help guide you through your negotiations, and you can share the link of any property that you're thinking about buying, and we can help you work out whether it's A, B, C grade or a no-go zone. Trust me, You will buy a hell of a lot better without guidance, and you'll overpay by a lot more than that $1,000, $990, if you don't know what you're doing.
And right now, we're recording this on a Wednesday. We are about to go straight into Campfire, where we have 3 students. 2 are in negotiations and 1 has an auction on Saturday. Can't wait to help them work through those challenges. In this episode, we've only touched on a tiny part of the huge amount of things you need to know to become an educated first home buyer. There is so much more for you to do. You can learn all of the steps in the right order and avoid all of the mistakes that others have made in our 10-step online course for first home buyers.
If you'd like to learn more about the right process and avoid making rookie errors, become an educated home buyer. Head over to the website, check out your first home buyer guide, the course that we have created for you. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you won't miss an episode. And if you've liked what you've heard today, please give us an iTunes review. It helps other people find us. And of course, I know it's a bit cringy, but we're going to ask for 5 stars. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. We hope you found this really useful. And if you have, please share the love with others who you know are in the same boat. We'll be back next week with more priceless stuff.